I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist,
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
and this is When East
Meets West. So, we're talking about a really important topic today that our listeners may have been familiar with already if they're fans of Brene Brown, but we're going to be talking about vulnerability, which is,
Yeah.
Something that Pete and I talk a lot about.
Love being vulnerable.
which, in case you can't tell, that's
A little
sarcasm in his voice.
sarcasm.
A
I
little
actually don't
sarcasm.
mind being vulnerable.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's part of our work. I mean, sometimes I think, having chosen being a psychologist, we have to be vulnerable,
absolutely.
right? Don't you feel that way?
Well, yeah, and we've been trained in how to practice it,
That's
right?
right.
So
Yeah.
so it's definitely a skill, but I think what you're implying in the sarcasm, right, is that which I of course feel this too. It's not fun. It's not
Yeah.
fun to be vulnerable, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Or it's fun because I know I want to grow, and I think that's, so
Well,
like,
yeah. Well,
yeah.
the growth part. It's maybe. Well, I would argue it. Then maybe it's interesting. It can be interesting, right? But
Yeah.
I wouldn't say like while I'm
Fun.
being vulnerable, I'm like this feels fantastic.
Yeah, that's
You
true.
know?
Because I think recently, having tough conversations with people that we're close with, where maybe we're
Yeah.
trying to like encourage them to do something different or assert some sort of boundary in the relationship. Those are things that I find myself that I'll avoid,
Yeah.
even though I feel super comfortable with this. So thank you. Yes, you
Yeah.
that's correct. Thank you.
Well, yeah, you're welcome. I'm only saying that because I don't want anyone to be under the impression
I
that
know.
vulnerability just feels fabulous. I mean, I even, I recently said to a friend where I was, having a difficult conversation and was being vulnerable, and my very, very dear old friend of mine said, "Well, you're, you're frankly like better at being vulnerable
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
than I am because of, I think part of what you do." And I said, I hear that. I was like, that's true. And I was like, and, I just want you to know, I don't like it.
Yeah.
I still don't like it.
I
It's
feel that
like,
way at, like, funerals, like they're
mm,
so vulnerable, and like we as psychologists were meant to like maybe this is my own stuff, but like I feel like they're like people we're supposed to say the right thing, like that we know
yeah,
what to say or how to
well,
handle those
I
emotions.
know, I know.
Yeah,
Well, because I think people forget that psychologists are humans first.
yeah,
It's like,
they do forget that.
they
Yeah,
do. I mean, I'm always kind of surprised actually when I'm, talking about vulnerability in session with people and I'm sharing how I feel uncomfortable in session when I have to bring up a difficult conversation with a patient. Like if the patient's angry with me, or I don't know, it's just something awkward. I don't know that I'll say, yeah, it's really hard for me. I'll feel uncomfortable. People go, really, it is? I'm
yeah,
like, yeah, I'm a person. I'm like, do you like having awkward conversations?
I know.
I don't. I mean, I
Yeah.
do it because it's aligned with my values and I know it's workable.
Well,
But I
I think
certainly don't enjoy it.
and maybe we could talk a little bit about Brene Brown's work, because I think you mentioned her
Hmm.
in the beginning, and so thinking about what even led. I don't know if you know. I'm
I
sure you
do know.
do. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you know
So
the story?
yeah,
Do you know the story too? Do you know?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, well, share it. Share what
No,
her.
you.
Oh, you. Okay. So I always think it's so hilarious and adorable because it's just like so true for all people.
Yeah.
Brene Brown tells the story that when she was doing research on it, and she was investigating
Researcher down in
vulnerability.
Texas. Yep.
Yeah, she's at University of Houston. She's PhD in social work, and she, it was, I think the research was around vulnerability and connection specifically. Was that the first line of her
I
studies,
think
or?
so. Or shame. Shame came second.
Oh, yeah, extreme came second. So what she found was that in order to connect with other people, that it would required vulnerability. And she was basically, she just talks about this in her Netflix special, Call to Courage. She says she was
Mm,
basically so distressed by finding that out that she had to
yeah.
go to her own therapy to work to work
That's
through that this was
yeah.
like that it has to be vulnerability, that it's a part of human connection. And I was like, man, if that doesn't, you know, resonate.
Yeah. Well, because you have to like, you have to connect. And so I think sometimes I find it so useful, like say if you're working with a client through a relationship, so if they're,
Hmm.
so as a working with high performers, like sometimes they feel like their partner has to serve a certain role. And I work
Sure.
with them about finding ways of being vulnerable with their partners to like create connection. Because you totally see that that creates another level of connection.
Well, because it's in that space of basically being an imperfect human that we're saying
Yeah.
like I struggle, like I have pain, I mess up.
Yeah.
that's, in self-compassion research, they talk about this too, that's an aspect of self-compassion, is recognizing a common humanity.
Yeah.
And if we're walking around telling ourselves and other people that we got it all figured out, and
Mhm.
nothing ever goes wrong, and I can think of my own life when I've encountered people like that. It makes me feel so disconnected from that person, and also so alone.
Yeah.
Because then I start to go like, oh, maybe I'm the only one that's having a hard time, or I don't have life figured out. It's like,
Yeah.
no, none of us do.
No, and I think it's this word that it's another one, the thing where
Hmm.
people use it a lot. But I wonder, so one exercise I'll ask people to think about is like give examples of being vulnerable.
Mm.
Either that you've been vulnerable or moments where you feel like you can find that you might be able to be vulnerable. Because I
Hmm.
think, you know, I don't know, do we want to talk about maybe some examples of being vulnerable?
Yeah, I can share a personal one about doing
Yeah,
this podcast.
there it
So,
is.
yeah, there it is. Yeah, so Pete's been after me to do something along the lines of this podcast for, I don't know, probably as long as we've known each other. And we've known each other 10 years,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, you've probably been
and
after me to do
variations of this. Yes,
variations of
yeah.
something.
I made you come
And
to do the shrinks. Yep.
yes, yep, you wanted me to do a TV show. I didn't want to do it. And what did I say to you every time you were like, "Come
You
on, we
just,
got to do this."
you just want to be private.
I want to be private.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I am. And I think this would probably surprise a lot of people knowing me, because I have a very extroverted,
Yeah.
I always like to say it's my phenotype. My presentation is very extroverted. I'm actually like pretty introverted in a lot of ways. And I'm actually like a really private person.
Yeah.
And so this feels like terribly risky for
Yeah.
me. Frankly, it's really hard for me. Like when I agreed to do the podcast, I and I don't mean that in a poor me kind of way. I just more
No.
mean in a way, it's actually, I feel very exposed when I
Yeah.
when I do these types of things. And the reason I chose to do the podcast with Pete is not just because I adore Pete and like
Mhm.
meeting with him every week.
I beat it down.
Yes, yeah, he did. It's actually because, and I want to tie this together for our listeners, is because it aligns with my values. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that are very important to me to share, and I
Well,
want to
you're one
share
of the
beyond.
best teachers that I've ever
Oh,
met.
thank you.
And
Oh,
so
that's very sweet.
I think, your vulnerability was like making yourself exposed around even teaching to such a larger potential audience, which for all we know, there's, our moms are listening and that's it, so
Right, right. Yeah. So yeah, not to assume we've got 10 million listeners here,
well,
though.
and that's part of Brene Brown's story, right? Where that she did
Right.
that TED talk where she was just really discussing her research, which how many researchers have done TED talks?
Right. I don't know.
And then this
A
one just
jillion.
blew up and became like,
Totally.
overnight she had millions of followers. And because people connect, so Nikki, people connect with this challenge that you've had around just allowing yourself to feel exposed for this ultimate goal of living congruent with your values. And I think the reason I said you're such a great teacher is because then also educating, and I think that that's
Right.
a big value of yours, is just educating people to help ultimately eliminate some suffering.
Yes, absolutely, and thank you for saying that. And I think that it's important then for me to say that in doing this podcast, the reason why it's so vulnerable for me is that it's taking a risk.
Yeah,
And what I always teach to patients is that acting aligned with our values is healthy risk taking, is the
that's
best
right.
way that I can say it. It's a healthy
Yeah.
risk taking. So you're saying, this is meaningful to me. I don't know how it's going to turn out, and I'm willing to try something where I know that I can make like, look, I'm going to stick I'm sure I probably already have, or will stick my foot in my mouth, give wrong information, make a mistake.
Yeah.
And that's uncomfortable to sit with, and I'm
Yeah.
willing to be vulnerable in the service of, and of education.
Yeah.
So I know,
Well, and
like,
we will put our foots in our mouth. And I
yeah,
think,
absolutely,
and
that's gonna.
and so just along these lines of sharing about the podcast, like I think one time you and I realized with one episode we misspoke about a date of like the or origin of behaviorism, and I'm
Oh
like,
yeah, it was Skinner.
yeah,
We said 1920s, and then I was like, ooh, 1960s. I
yeah, it
just.
didn't feel great. And who cares,
I
because the
know.
bottom
Yeah.
line was, and I think that
Yeah.
was part of our practice of saying, not
Yeah.
who cares. I'm not trying to say like, it's important to know, but I will say when I teach, whenever that history section comes in, the historical
Hmm.
context,
Hmm.
I go the quickest, because also like as a mindfulness and Zen practitioner, it's about this moment. So I
Yeah.
try and get as quickly to July, 2020,
Yes.
And so I think, but that's an example of like, we're not going to be perfect. We're going to misspeak. We are going to say things that are not entirely factual. These are our opinions, our training, or our recollection of our training, because
Yeah.
in our mid-careerness,
Or early mid-career.
early mid-career, we start to
And
forget things, and that's okay
yeah.
too. Because we
Yeah.
learn new things and we would forget some other
Absolutely.
things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, so for Pete, what's an example for you where you've, done something vulnerable that you'd be willing to share with people listening?
Yeah, I know. Well, it's if we were more, yeah, I have to think. I mean, I think it's a tough question. I think, you know, in any given day that I'm teaching. Okay, so vulnerability. When I do some of my TV, my media work,
Oh
I
yeah.
often feel very vulnerable. So, you know, right now we're recording this during the pandemic still, and so some of the channels that I work with, they're still doing like virtual
Mm-hmm.
interviews, so there's no one in the studio still. But when I used to be in live studio recordings, I was super vulnerable, and I think the vulnerability there is, am I going to say the right thing? Am I going to misspeak? I will say
Mm-hmm.
one time after one of them, I said thermostat instead of thermometer,
Mm.
and the first person to call that out was my mother, which was really nice. So I was talking to her after, and she was like, "Oh yeah, it was really funny. Mike and I were sitting there, and you said thermostat instead of thermometer."
Thank you, Mom.
Thank you for the exposure, Bob. But we could laugh about that, and that's
Yeah.
exactly what I was trying to do. And it's okay, because I think, yeah, that's
Yes.
vulnerability of like, I misspoke. I said thermostat instead of thermometer. And those moments do culminate,
They do.
collectively. Yeah,
Yes, they
yeah,
do. They do. Well, and I think that's actually one reason why people often don't want to practice vulnerability,
right,
because they don't want to carry around with them the discomfort that we feel when we mess up, or I don't know, like, example I think most people can resonate with, you share your romantic feelings with somebody and they don't
yeah,
they don't return the sentiment.
yeah,
We carry those things around, and so what does the human brain do? The human brain, goes into problem solving mode and is like, I know,
yeah,
I'll just stop being uncomfortable. I'll stop
yeah,
taking risks.
yeah,
And it's, it makes a lot of sense logically, frankly,
yeah,
right? Like, of course, like the brain's like, problem solved. I know how to deal
yeah.
with this. But then without that healthy risk taking, which is what practicing vulnerability really is, your world gets so small. Like there's
And
no
that was
opportunity.
and that's one of the best, in my opinion, findings from Brene Brown's research, is that you can't choose what feelings you're going to experience. So like your
Yeah.
brain will shut down and say, hey, don't have that scary things, but then you also then shut down to positive experiences.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, that was like one of the biggest take home from a lot of her research, is that you need to experience. And that in a mindfulness world, going into the Eastern practice, is that we don't judge the moment. So no
No.
matter what I'm experiencing, I'm just experiencing, and then I just want to walk into that,
Yes.
but not choose positive or negative.
Right. And I think the reason why, again, people have a hard time understanding, like, but why would I want to walk into the discomfort?
Yeah,
Why would I want to do that? Aside from, like, you and I can say, to the cows come home, like, to grow, which
right.
again, I think logically a lot of people will say, like, yes, I want to grow, I want to evolve. But the brain's like, but why do I want to be uncomfortable again? Right? Is what Pete and I in our practice as acceptance and commitment therapy clinicians, known as ACT, as a type of third wave CBT. It's in the service of what is important to you.
Right.
So, like I was using the example with the podcast, like I highly value education and dissemination. And so I'm
Yeah.
willing to feel uncomfortable and exposed in doing the podcast in the service of sharing that, which is
Thank
gives me
goodness.
thank yes, thank goodness, thank goodness,
Thank goodness
very
that's your value.
very meaningful to me.
Yeah.
And other examples would be, again, like if I go back to the sharing romantic feelings for
Yeah.
somebody, right? It's like, if you don't know what the other person thinks, if you value relationships, you value love, right?
Yeah.
Are you willing to take that risk and share how you feel with another person, to see if maybe they feel the same way back? I mean, how many stories have you heard of those,
Oh
when someone,
God.
they never told each other how they
Yeah.
felt and they went on,
Yeah.
never, it just, it gets in the way of actually experiencing meaning in our lives if we're not willing to take those risks,
Yeah. Yeah. And with managers, coworkers, other family members. I mean, these are all really hard they're hard moments and good opportunities to try and have some of those really challenging conversations. But I know I avoid them sometimes. My brother, I know he ain't gonna be listening to this podcast, so that's okay. I'll say that. Because sometimes
I was, I was like, maybe, hi, if you're listening. It's been a long time.
Yeah, and we can have that conversation if you're listening.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
yeah,
That's right.
yeah, and here we are. But point is, like, there are certain things that I just today actually we had a conversation about the COVID because his belief systems are maybe a little bit different and sort of wondering if there's any conspiracies and it's not sure what to believe, what he's reading and not reading. And there are moments that those are really hard conversations to have, and frankly I will avoid them at times.
Well, I'm glad that you're bringing that up because I think that a lot of people often have the question, or I get asked the question, I should say, in session a lot. Well, when should I practice vulnerability? Like, when is it safe to be vulnerable? And I think,
low with that question.
Yeah, yeah, and it is an important one though because it's not like I don't want anyone listening to think that Pete and I are advocating to be really vulnerable in every situation with every person. It's not actually always safe to do that. And there might be certain contexts
That's
where
right.
being vulnerable is not workable, right? Like if you know, potentially sometimes with Pete's brother, maybe it's not workable to be very vulnerable about, a difference in beliefs. Sometimes it is, for the opportunity to potentially to grow in that situation. But it's like if you have a verbally abusive,
I was just going to say that.
or any kind of abusive partner, boss, friend, sharing the intimacy of how you feel is actually not a safe choice, like
Well, and
other
sometimes,
behaviors.
and sometimes like high performers, like athletes or finance guys, like being vulnerable with your boss, your manager, your coach, not always a great idea.
No, and I think what I would want people to know in those situations is that it doesn't mean then you're failing being vulnerable. It's just like actually a different behavior is more workable. So if we think of vulnerability as a practice, as a behavior, it's effective when you're able to potentially connect with somebody, right? Like that somebody else, that other person is someone that you trust. Which again, trust and vulnerability also go hand in hand here, right? That they're potentially safe, right? But if you have plenty of data about someone that they're not a safe person, actually disconnecting emotionally in those moments is going to be more effective.
Being more effective. Yes. I mean, I think, and that's the thing is like sometimes you feel like you have to adhere to like the length of a relationship, even though the person is maybe not the best for you. And that's not a moment to be vulnerable then. That might be a moment to assert and actually cut a boundary or, cut the person off, and that's, it's important. That's the thing that's been happening with some reporters or stories now where they're saying like during a pandemic, how do you do these things? And I'm like, no, these are things that we should have been doing pre-COVID.
Yeah, being in the pandemic just puts a giant spotlight on this stuff, right? That there's, more space than usual for people to be curious about what might work and what might not work. But yes, I do just want to make sure that we're clear about that with regards to vulnerability as a behavior, a practice that, aids in healthy risk taking aligned with one's values, though like any other behavior, and this comes back to flexibility, which obviously Pete and I talk a lot about since that's an aim of both mindfulness practices and third wave behavior therapies. It's not a one size fits all, right? It's not going to be an effective choice in every context, in every situation.
Right. Yeah, no, and so that's I think they refer to that as like the window of vulnerability. When you have the moment to do it. When it's right. So I think it's important to feel strong during those moments. If you're feeling like this is something you want to do, so make sure you get good rest, eat well.
Yes.
Don't do it when you're like intoxicated.
Right. Well, which actually, and I'm glad you're bringing that up. That's because that's actually not being vulnerable,
That's
right?
right.
If people that are like, oh, I want to have this hard conversation after I've had a few drinks. I'm like,
Yeah.
well, I can understand why,
Yeah.
because it's
You're looser.
easy. Yeah, you're looser, though. That's not the practice, right?
That's right.
Like actually, I always think of one thing Brene Brown says. Obviously, we're referencing her a lot because she's the
Primary
person.
resource,
Yeah, she's the person about vulnerability research. That she said that like she's working with some company, and so I think it was like a tech company or something
Yeah.
she does consulting with, and they said, oh, we came up with an algorithm to figure out like when to practice vulnerability. And she was like, oh, that's cool, very interesting, call it whatever you want, but that's not vulnerability, because
That's right.
there's no risk involved in that.
There's no
right?
risk. Yep.
There's no
Yeah.
risk.
Yeah.
Being, I always like to say to people, being alive is risky, is inherently
Yes.
risky.
Yeah.
Right? So vulnerability is an opportunity to choose healthy risks that actually have the opportunity to make your life better, more meaningful.
Wow.
This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin.
And I'm Dr. Pete Economo. Be present, be brave. This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.